Welcome to the webinar about team collaboration with Clicker. I'm Amy Connolly, an occupational therapist and an AT specialist coming from SETC as well as the Bellingham Public Schools. And I'm joined here with Sarah Ayers. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Sarah Ayers, and I'm a speech language pathologist and AT specialist for Special Education Technology Center. And I also work for Bellevue School District.
And our materials today are available via a short link as well as this QR code. You'll find the slides published there. So our purpose is to discuss what team collaboration looks like when using Clicker. It's obviously very important for reasons we can imagine, but we'll talk about the importance of each of the roles and the challenges and benefits of collaboration, give some specific examples, and hopefully some tips that can help you save time. So as we get started, folks who are joining us, could you mention in the chat your role and maybe your experience with Clicker? And that'll help us frame the information that we share. Just give everyone a moment for that. So your name, your role, actually your name will be automated there. I'm watching the chat to see who's here. I'm not seeing any comments, but I do see, oh, perfect. Megan, welcome, Megan, AT specialist in SLP, and Rosie, an OT. Wonderful. I'm so happy we have at least these disciplines represented here today. So I'll keep going. We want to start. Actually, I think I saw in the chat that Rosie, that you have, maybe you're feeling a little newer to Clicker. So we're going to start with some overview about Clicker. The Cricksoft webpage happens to be down right now, which is unfortunate because it's actually a wonderful website with a lot of great information. The Clicker Basics page is one of the first places we usually send people to get familiar with Clicker. I'll say too that the tour is very helpful. This link happens to be for Windows and Mac, but once the website is running, you'll find one for the apps as well. Those apps are on iPad and Chromebook. So the tour gives you an interactive view of the features. But if you go to Clicker Basics and you're scanning for that specific feature that you wanted to locate within the tool, the way that this information is organized is really helpful because you can zoom in on the feature and then locate that tool within Clicker. So it allows you to be really clear about what you're looking for and how to find it. Highly recommend those two resources. The Clicker Basics is also a series of short videos that are easy to share with your teams. So as you can see here, Clicker has supports for writing, reading, vocabulary building, as well as talking and planning literacy activities.
And I just wanted to add one more thing to that. I share out those videos a lot from an AT specialist standpoint with staff because they're so short, they're really easily digestible. So highly recommend once the site is working again, using those to supplement any training that you do in your district.
Yeah, they're really well done. In addition, as you know, we have this series at SETC. Today, we're going to talk about team collaboration. And then in early December, we're going to talk about how our Comprehensive Literacy for All book collection contains clicker sets for each book, which is a wonderful gift. We've been provided from Barb Lark, a volunteer, and Tanya May from Cricksoft. They're collaborating to create clicker sets that we can pick up and use. Additionally, I featured a webinar in the spring about alternative access. And that's really one of the big draws for me as an OT and AT specialist. Clicker does afford us some options for alternative access. So if you're getting into the weeds there, you can go back to that recording on YouTube. And we have a website that is designed to curate this information for SETC, those who are affiliated with SETC, perhaps doing a trial via SETC. So that link should work once their website is operational again. As far as an overview of what is Clicker, I tend to call it a suite of child-friendly word processing tools. The Clicker contains writing grids, and that refers to the area below the document typically, which provides scaffolds for writing. And we have a spectrum from sentence connect to word bank with decreasing scaffolds. So the sentence sets are going to be much more linear. The connect sets allow for more variability in how you build a sentence. The word bank is what it sounds like, a collection of words. Clicker also contains planning boards like graphic organizers, the ability to make Clicker books, which you can put supportive features in, like having speech support and matching sets. You can do custom sets, and we'll talk about learning grids, which are the on-demand resources from Cricksoft. Here's an example of a sentence set from learning grids. You can see that the pictures can be included. We don't recommend having symbols with the text as they're entering the words, but having a picture to stimulate thinking about a topic can be really nice and help illustrate ideas. On the left, you can see that this sentence set has a model above it. And on the picture on the right, it's a small blurry picture, but you can see that there are options for, well, if you could see it, you could tell that there would be options for adjusting how that model is presented to the student, whether it is momentarily visible, maybe it's only audible, or maybe it stays visible above that sentence grid below. And the further settings allow you to determine how active the buttons are, so that someone might be guided in a specific order. You can dictate whether the words are presented in the natural sentence order or in a random order, as the picture shows, so that the students are sequencing words within a sentence. And in addition to using the Clicker grids, the keyboard is always available to enter text. So one of the big conceptual things about Clicker is that this white area towards the top is the document, and the bottom area is the set, or that Clicker scaffold, which is what Clicker is known for. So within a set, you can have many pages, and you would arrow through them to write different sentences all on the same document. And some of the key features in Clicker are that speech support. It is pretty authentic. It's got some children's voices, which my students have really appreciated. That provides typing feedback and encourages engagement. Being able to put voice notes in your documents is nice. So maybe typing, even dictating might be frustrating, but being able to record a student's voice as an audio note is really nice. And word prediction. I appreciate in Clicker that we can change the appearance of the word prediction box. There are more constraints on other word prediction tools that we have available, and yet in Clicker we can dock it, we can change the number of options, the contrast, the size of the font. So it's a pretty cool feature of Clicker. Sarah, would you like to speak to Clicker and UDL?
Sure.
Or I can continue.
Yeah, no, I'll speak to it briefly. I don't think we need to spend too much time in it, but Clicker is a fantastic tool when we're considering universal design for learning. So both, all three of the areas, representation, expression, and engagement. Within Clicker, as this slide here shows, there are various options for representation. So there's the learning grid resources, which are those pre-made templates. There are different options within, as Amy mentioned, either using those voice notes or typing with the scaffolds. And you can also use the picture support. So lots of options for representation. And then on the next slide, this shows some of the options for engagement. So it's really engaging for students. And we have some quotes coming up in a second where you can hear from actual students what they thought of it. But with all the variety of options in there, whether it's painting, drawing, using it for whole class instruction, small group instruction, the picture support, again, very engaging program for students. And then options for expression. Amy spoke to this already as well. There's the talk sets and the document writing grids, lots of different ways that a student can express their work. And then these here are some quotes from general education students who were in third grade at the time and used Clicker as a whole class support. So you can read on here, first student said, it's a good app to use to make books, especially if you want to be an author. Another student said, you can do more than books. Clicker is fun. I had fun exploring the stuff you can do. It's good for writing books with voice recordings. Clicker 8 is good. I like how you can write books and find matching pictures. So speaking to that engagement piece and, again, different options for expression there.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. This feedback is really nice to hear, and I want to give a kind of caveat to help frame some of the stories that we're going to share. As we mentioned, I'm from Bellingham Public Schools and Sarah's from Bellevue. And one of the big differences in our experiences with Clicker is that in my district, it's really kind of a tier 3 tool. Our licensing is more limited, so we will only consider Clicker when a student is really not accessing the Microsoft word processing tools, really not benefiting from the universal technology, or even kind of a tier 2 read and write type tool. So Clicker is where we would go to in that instance. And Sarah has had experiences in Bellevue where they do have a whole domain license, a district-wide access to Clicker. So there's more stories and anecdotes from using Clicker as a tier 1 tool. So we wanted to talk about team roles today. First and foremost, we have our special education teacher, whom we regard as responsible for the content and integrating these tools into the curriculum, assessing how students are progressing, and then collaborating with the entire team. As an example, Sarah, would you like to share about this example?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is from a general education classroom again. So thinking, as Amy mentioned, more from that tier 1 all students support level. This was a Clicker set that was made to support an ongoing activity, weekend news. So every Monday, this was done in a second grade classroom in collaboration with the general education teacher. And initially some other folks were helping her. So the special education teacher was in the room, as well as the MLL, multi-language learning teacher facilitator, who we'll speak about coming up in a little while. But what they did was they had this weekend news template. And so if a student required this level of support, they could use the Clicker set that you see there. And it's stayed the same time after time. So it really was a time saver for the class. And then if a student didn't need this level of scaffolding and support, they could simply just type in and, use voice notes if they wanted to, use word prediction, whatever strategy and scaffold that they needed.
You'll begin to hear a theme throughout this webinar that once you have a template, it's really empowering for the whole team to use Clicker over and over again and for students to build their skills in that familiar structure.
And this is another example from the second grade classrooms at the same school. They chose to use Clicker books to create biography reports. So you can see here a screenshot of an actual assignment that was done and how that student accessed this assignment. I did want to pause briefly since we've been talking about application in the tier 1 realm. And I'm curious, Megan, if I can put you on the spot, do you have any examples that you said in the chat that you've used it a little bit as a tier 1 support in your district? Do you have any examples you might want to share?
I wouldn't say it's a tier 1. It's more to supplement the students already that were on IEPs to help with like their speech goals, but relating it to the curriculum.
Gotcha.
So like if they were learning about ecosystems, being able to make a Clicker set that talks about ecosystems, but brings down the vocabulary level to where they are to tie more into their IEP goals. Unfortunately, in our district, we only have so many licenses. So we're not necessarily able to use it as a tier 1.
Gotcha. Thank you, though. That's very helpful to hear how you used it there.
Mm-hmm. Great example. Shall I go on, Sarah?
Yeah. So you'll see on this slide here, there's a link to a PDF that is a very comprehensive document created by Cricksoft in partnership with Beth Poss. And they do a beautiful job in this document of showing how you can use Clicker to support a shared writing activity called predictable chart writing. And you'll see on the graphic here that they have outlined how you can use different components of the software for different parts of the week of predictable chart writing. And for those of you who may not know what it is, predictable chart writing is a shared writing experience where a classroom will have a theme and oftentimes core vocabulary words that are part of a sentence stem or a partial sentence that then students are able to complete with their own ideas. And so Clicker can be used as a digital tool to supplement this shared writing experience. Did you want to speak to this one, Amy?
Sure. I will just, flowing from that last topic of predictable chart writing, Sarah and I have had the opportunity to support a collaborative team which runs a literacy group. And while they're doing predictable chart writing, I think they found it a little bit challenging to incorporate Clicker for that routine. So it depends on many factors in the room, but something that they did enjoy doing was using a Clicker board as the kind of sign-in routine for that literacy group. So they had a prompt or a question in the beginning of the group that had students weighing in on their opinions. In this case, I think they were reading like "We're going on a bear hunt," and so they asked if each student likes bears. So this was projected onto the display in the classroom, and they probably used the whiteboard to fill in the responses, or if the student needed alternative access, they would have had their computer set up.
I love this. And actually, going back for 1 minute, this was an example that is talked about in the Comprehensive Literacy for All book, where they talked about using the opportunities to sign in and out of various activities as a literacy activity. So practicing using whatever alternative pencil it is, in this case, the keyboard, if the student's able to access it or whatever modality. I just think that's a great example of an authentic writing experience.
Mm-hmm. Here's another example from that group where they did attempt the predictable chart writing in a Clicker Connect set. So as you can see, there's a component of the sentence which provides options, and that therefore I know it's a Clicker Connect set. And each tab was allowing a student to independently add their sentence to the chart. So it's a blank document for now, but if you can imagine tabbing through, that's how the students would contribute to the chart. You could also do some different ways of attributing authorship at the end of each line, like using the different features here, which we'll go into. So now this brings us, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we're going to transition now to another role, which is the speech language pathologist. And you'll see there is a lot of overlap in all of these different roles. So we're going to identify roles or ways that you might utilize Clicker within this role, but just know that there is a lot of overlap again. So what we talked about within a teacher's domain, you could do as an SLP as well. But specific to SLPs, thinking about how we could use Clicker to support language, we linked on there document, which is also a webinar, a recorded webinar from Cricksoft on how to support students who have SLI, which stands for speech language impairments. And it's really focused on using Clicker to support both speech, but mostly language, different concepts, vocabulary development, all different things for that kind of what I consider higher level language learning. And vocabulary could be for that level student, but it could also be for our non-speaking students. So you'll see in a minute, we could use Clicker boards to talk about descriptive teaching for new vocabulary words using core vocabulary that might be in a student's device. Oh, thank you, Amy. So here, using a Clicker board to support vocabulary development, if the word that the student is learning, the curricular academic word is adapt, you could put that, whatever that word is, in the middle. And then the words that are surrounding it could be words that either define or describe or are examples of that vocabulary word, and they go all the way around. So in doing this, you're using the core vocabulary words that the student has access to, like change or different or not same, some of those really familiar words, and building them around the the academic vocabulary word in the middle, so that in this process, the student is also learning how to define and describe that academic word.
Would you like to say anything about this example?
Yeah, so this is just a really brief example that came from that recorded webinar that I mentioned, that's showing how you could teach specific language concepts. So in this case, they're working on prepositions. So the boy is, and then the student has a choice of selecting in, next to, or on, and then his bike. So putting it all together in a sentence, really working on the skill of prepositions.
Awesome. And was there anything more from this page that you'd like to talk about?
There's one more slide that is a little bit blurry that's coming up, and that has to do with what we described on the previous slide of customization. So this comes from Lake Washington School District, and they have district-wide access, or had, I'm not sure if they still do, to Clicker. And so what they did was they created this board that is, or was, their district-wide core vocabulary board, and they recreated it within Clicker. So then teachers could use this, project it on their smart boards, and use it as a tool to model language as they're providing instruction for the class.
Next, we'll talk about the occupational therapist role. As you probably know, the OT is really focused on access and access to education in the school setting. So looking at fine motor skills, especially as that relates to writing and accessing books, as well as when we need something pretty different. So alternative access methods like switches and eye gaze. And we obviously have a role in literacy instruction. I feel this very personally because I believe that literacy instruction is essential to autonomous communication. So I feel that all of our OTs should be interested in how they could use Clicker to support students if they have access. And as far as a mental model, something that we learned about in school was called the PEO, the Person, Environment, and Occupation model. And it's really just this dynamic interaction between who the student is, what is their role in school, and what is the environment around them, what does it afford them to do, or what are the barriers, and then really striving for participation there in the middle. So here's an example when I had the opportunity to provide OT services, not strictly as an AT specialist, but just workload relief for our OT team. I inherited a caseload of some students working on writing, and I saw them struggling a lot. They were reluctant to participate, and yet they were pretty excited about something they'd just done that weekend. And in this case, the student was excited that he had visited the Hama Hama oyster bar on the peninsula, and he got to dig for oysters. He had all these great anecdotes about it, and with his permission, we recorded him telling his story. That dictation captured some key words, which I just copied into the word bank pretty quickly, because when you're creating a word bank, you can just provide a passage basically, and if it's formatted with the appropriate commas, it becomes a word bank. So then he used the word bank to write this story. So on the far left, you have his handwritten version, and on the far right, what you see is his work, his story, which is several more sentences, includes a picture that he selected, and the analytics, which allowed his teacher to understand what strategies he used to incorporate each word. So it's color coded, and I'm sorry it's so tiny. You can see, I think the words in teal came from the word bank. The other words he typed, and he enjoyed that authentic speech feedback that sounded like him. Another student I worked with at the time when I was more strictly an OT was someone who had been working on a book of drawings and related writings. So she had a lot of difficulty focusing and staying engaged. She was in 3rd grade, and this process was I think it was wonderful how she had been engaged in creating content, but I saw how the physical demands of the task were also discouraging her. So we experimented with Clicker using Clicker books, and we would take a picture of her drawing. She would record a voice note of her talking about the drawing, and then she would use a variety of input methods to write about her drawing. And this allowed her to use the keyboard with no restraint. I was really interested in what she would do if she just got to play entering all these letters and listening to them. And I saw that she started to refine her intention towards, like, after being given the permission to just enter random letters and then listen to them, she wanted to listen to a letter before entering it. And so it was just a wonderful example of engagement, and she was really proud of her book. We could print it and share it. One thing she also enjoyed doing was the paint tool. It's not featured here in the pictures, but she could have entered a electronic or digital ink there in her pages. Another example from an OT standpoint, this was one of our earlier uses of Clicker. We have a school that is an IB school, or International Baccalaureate, where they have an inquiry, and I Wonder was an exercise everyone had been doing in the school. They were going to look at a salmon tank, and for a student who had visual impairment and significant motor difficulties, they found Clicker to be pretty helpful because they could structure that sentence kind of like in the SLP example previously, and allow the student to select what her wonder would be. And they did use some of the settings that were like guided order. And as continuing in the theme of motor access, our PTs are very important because we need to know students are in a position ready to learn. Are their bodies well supported, but are they in an active position and able to engage? This brings us to our teacher of students with visual impairments and teacher of the deaf. I work closely with these individuals, and we call them our eyes and ears. And so they are both obviously very important when it comes to adapting materials. In my experience, especially our teacher of students with visual impairments she's been involved in directing teams in what kinds of contrast is required, making a custom clicker set to provide a visually adapted keyboard that's on screen, and then communicating these principles to teams so that the accommodations can be implemented in a consistent manner. So here's a visual showing how you can set a default for the background of the document and the color of the text. Additionally, I've worked with our TSBI on when a student with a visual impairment needed more speech feedback from his typing so that he could make edits, and also needed to be able to use word prediction in a visually accessible manner, which was a limit on the iPad. The built-in word prediction was very low contrast and just wasn't meeting his needs. So we were wanting to explore Clicker for these reasons. And additionally, being able to give a voice note would allow him more options, because sometimes his speech was difficult to understand, so the computer wasn't able to understand him super well for that dictation, but by providing an audio note to his teacher, he could demonstrate his knowledge. And quite naturally, I know that Megan, you're an AT specialist as well, so you can imagine your role. In my experience, it's been important to learn about Clicker, to know what it affords our teams and our students, and then to work with the company to adjust licensing so that it is appropriate for students and staff. And then hugely to interface with our IT departments to make sure that the software is installed on the appropriate devices, that it's updated regularly. And then there's the the obvious goal of outreach and demonstrating the possibility of Clicker. So I'm excited about this webinar and having a recording. I think it might help me in my role in Bellingham to communicate some of the purposes. And
can we go back or pause there for
yeah.
1 sec? I wanted to add one more that I forgot to add on the slide too, which is training. I think a big part of what we do as AT specialists with regard to Clicker and many other software is making sure that people know how to use it. And so whether that's directing them back to the website when it's working with those short video clips, or if it's, you know, leading longer trainings within the district. And we've tried to do a lot of that in my district, especially to justify, since we have so many licenses of this. So a big part of our role, I think, is that training.
Yeah, and you're right, we didn't list that as a bullet, but in my next example, this is where I collaborated closely with a team supporting a student who had alternative access. She uses one switch placed behind her knees, essentially, to navigate computers, and that requires a hold to scan and a release to select. And luckily within Clicker, there are some subtle settings that allowed us to make that compatible with her access method. So, you know, there was the all the work that led to that access method. And then there was the work, how do we use Clicker? How do we adjust the settings within Clicker and then implement it in her school day? And I'm going to tell you about this example, and then I'm going to tell you the reality of how she accesses. So because access is so difficult for her, we have to work hard to keep things really meaningful and engaging. I think to keep up that interest and that motivation to work as hard as much as it requires to write a letter. So we knew that she's highly social. She loves her family and her cousins who live far away. And so we engaged her in this letter writing routine where she used a Connect set to compose a message, and she was able to add emojis, and so you can see like a writing sample there. And what we really wound up doing here is printing this and using partner assisted scan on the printed materials to make her selections, because she actually points with her foot to say yes and no. While we were working on switch control, we knew that her preferred method was to point with her foot and just show with her body her yes and no. So that's how that became actionable for the team during the school day. And I'd say whatever works. We know there are limits to just being able to say yes and no, so we're always pushing for more access for her. But I think this allowed her to be engaged, to write letters, and she just loved being able to have this connection with people.
Amy, I just love that example so much. I think that it's great that the team could be that flexible and saying, okay, well, it's still a high cognitive load to work on that access piece of it. So let's remove that piece now while we're doing this letter writing, which is also a high cognitive load, and have her do it low tech, but you're using those same motor patterns, the same formatting and structure of the assignment, so that as that access becomes something that she can do a little bit with a little bit less load, then she could the high-tech version of it. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. It was really rewarding to see her engagement increase a lot. Her family was key to this because they would provide information about her family members and what she was interested in. So I'd say family has a very important role to play in Clicker implementation and literacy instruction more broadly. And this is a passage from the Comprehensive Literacy for All book, just really asserting the fact that there's not enough time in the school day to do all the things that we wish that we could do. And therefore, our families and our caregivers are key partners. I say that with a little mixed emotion because I know that layering on demands to families can be less than ideal. I mean, when they're already living their lives, but I think recognizing the importance of their influence is helpful as a team. So one way we built engagement with that student was having she chose to write to her mom, but this is a letter that she decided to write to her mom. So other school staff also play a role with Clicker. I think Sarah, you had some, well, I'll just say as far as the paraeducator, that was the individual on my students' team whom I trained the most due to staffing availability. So I showed her how she would use the flip book to use partner assisted scanning to access a template again that can be repurposed over and over again. And while the teacher was aware of what we were up to, it was just the paraeducator who was really implementing that every day. And Sarah, did you have another example?
Yeah, I mean, that is the case in Bellevue as well, where a lot of times it's our paraeducators who are using this program day in and day out with our kids, and they're using it to adapt maybe what the students are working on in the classroom, to support implementation in the general education classroom where possible, and then sharing that feedback and monitoring with the teacher too, the classroom teacher. But in Bellevue, we also had other school support staff, meaning, as I mentioned earlier, the MLL facilitator, multi-language learner facilitator was coming in the classroom. She really bought into use of Clicker for its picture dictionary support and these tools that were supporting the students that she was helping who may or may not have been special education students. So, really sharing this tool with people more broadly and seeing what application it might have for other school support staff members.
Mm-hmm. This is an example again of the analytics that allow you to communicate how it's working for a student, how they produce their written work. And I think the utility of this as far as progress monitoring is pretty self-evident. Sorry again for the blurry picture here, but it's giving you information like within a word, which letters were typed, which words were dictated, where word prediction was used, where the clicker grids were used. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I really can't emphasize it enough. Partnering with your IT is really essential with Clicker. It is a multifaceted tool. Within the iOS apps alone, there are 3 apps that we use. There's probably more from the company, but Clicker Writer, Clicker Books, and Clicker Talk are like the 3 apps which allow us to access our licensing. And then on the PC side, because that's what we use, Clicker, maybe it's 8, I'm not even sure. I just call it Clicker. That's the software that we need to have installed, and it needs to be installed with a serial number that allows it to access a license. So making sure that these pieces are in place are so important for our students and staff who are using Clicker. Managing the licenses can be a bit of a bear, to be honest. We have a dashboard from Cricksoft, which allows us to look at our PC and Mac side of things and our iOS and Chromebook side and figure out where these are installed. It's a part of the effort involved in implementing this tool. And in my district, that does land with me. I think it's true in Everett as well, that the AT specialist does that licensing, but it's in collaboration with our IT department. And then the last way that it's important for us to collaborate is regarding file sharing. So great, you made some work. Now, how are you going to share it with your teacher, or how are you going to repurpose that template? So it's important to know the options within Clicker for file sharing. I'll just jump ahead here. So one of the options is the network. And I believe this is how Bellevue has done it, where on any computer, there's a shared file location, and that location points within a building to that building. And there are problems with that because the writing and reading capabilities within that school extend to other students and staff. So you have a bit more access than it's not very private, but it is maybe reliable in a way. Cloud storage is something that we do in Bellingham. We use OneDrive. We just dictate it we choose it as the preferred method when we're installing Clicker. And I also use Dropbox because I had started that before we got streamlined. And so these are easy to change as a user of Clicker on your own device, but it's nice to have an expectation set for the district so that people are more consistent in how they share files. as an example of that, we have this is a screenshot of a handout that our IT department created that was directing people in how to specify OneDrive, how to configure your OneDrive so that your folder is shared between the right people, whether it's other staff members or a student, so that things are saved in the cloud and everyone knows where to go and get them. And then there's always email, which is a nice, simple way of sharing sets. You just don't have it saved in the cloud. There's a learning curve around understanding whether you've adapted the clicker set or the clicker dock, but that's where the training piece comes in.
And
So
before
IT,
we move on from IT, I just wanted to say one other way in which IT has really supported us in Bellevue is that sometimes things go wrong, as we know, with technology. And when we, as AT specialists, will write to the company, sometimes they'll put us in touch with their IT for Cricksoft. And I don't always understand the language that they speak when their reply comes through. And so being able to share, their help desk, if you will, with our IT and help desk, they speak that same language and they're able to kind of translate it for me so that I understand what to do.
Yeah, there's a wisdom there in knowing what's your domain and what requires that specialized knowledge to actually, process and guidance. And Toni Caggiano has been a wonderful support. She's our region's representative for Cricksoft, and she's always been eager to help when individual users are facing barriers or school systems at large. So definitely keep her name in your back pocket if you're using Clicker. Okay, on to some time-saving tips. Can't say enough about Learning Grids. That's the on-demand database of materials. If you enter a topic, you can specify what type of material, like a writing grid or a book, or you can just look at everything that's available related to a topic. So I think this is an example from Phases of the Moon. On the left is a book, and this book could be downloaded and then adapted. So while there's a speaker button that has that, if activated, it would read the page, you could remove that if you wanted your student to be reading themselves. On the right is a Connect set to support writing, and I'm sure there are many more related to Phases of the Moon. It's a nice example when you're digging into Learning Grids. So keep that in mind as a place to get started, and then keeping those as templates that you adapt is really helpful. Speaking of using templates, this is another example of something a classroom is able to repurpose over and over again, inviting students to give their feelings during morning meeting. I gave the example of the letter writing grid. I would imagine this would be pretty cool for a link between school and home, where every day the student writes some kind of message to their parents, or, I mean, if that's what they want to do and authentic. I've just seen a journaling, maybe a template for journaling would be pretty cool. We would be remiss not to mention this wonderful time-saving strategy, which is the Comprehensive Literacy for All book collection. You may have heard about it before. Our volunteer Barb Lark has created this incredible resource, which features literacy planning sheets for individual books. Additionally, many more materials, including clicker sets. As of today, we're partnering, well, really not just today. This morning we met to keep our project moving forward, but SETC is collaborating with SETBC in British Columbia to publish these clicker sets on their website. Their website is very well designed and user-friendly. And if you go to the SETBC website and search SETC as an affiliate, you'll see all of the clicker sets related to each book. So the word collector is there. Soon we'll have A Day with No Words, lots of common books that your classrooms are probably already using. So that's really good to know with respect to clicker. And more broadly, SETC is about to launch a website which gives you better access to the book collection. We're really excited to share that Probably it'll go live in December. Stay tuned. Another tip that we have used to facilitate team collaboration around Clicker is the use of Teams. Microsoft Teams is something that we use every day in Bellingham. So I created a shared channel for Clicker, and that allows me to invite any member across the district who is using Clicker. Right now we have about 50. And I try to welcome them when we have a new school beginning to implement it, and they can scroll up and see what were the helpful documents around file sharing, or the website for Bellingham, which included our launch webinar. And then I'm hoping that this grows over time and it becomes a way that people share templates. So as you can see in Teams, there's a files tab, and that gives us the chance to share things so that we're not always having to reinvent the wheel. I'm curious, Megan and Sarah, is there anything in your districts that help facilitate like professional learning community or connect Clicker users? Probably have our trainings that are periodic where people can meet.
We don't have that, but I really like the idea of the teams to set up, because we do have like a special services teams page that everyone that's in special education has access to in the district. So I'm wondering if we could make like a Clicker page set on there. We previously had an AT page set or team account. It just wasn't quite utilized as much by other members.
That's great, Megan. Thanks for sharing. I want to make an important distinction, which is that this is a shared channel distinct from teams. Like you can have teams within teams, and that kind of you draw from one group, and it's a little bit more like you share information relevant to that department. But this actually kind of protected sensitive information and allowed people from anywhere to just view the information in that channel. So just use that language, shared channel, when you go to your IT and talk about setting it up. Cool.
In Bellevue, we don't have that, but I think that's a fantastic idea. What we do have is we have a SharePoint site for assistive technology, and then within that, we have a page that has a bunch of Clicker resources. So we have some recorded trainings and things that we've done. But what I like about what you shared here is that community, you know, so people can share resources they've made. Hey, look what we did here. This is so great. And just building that excitement around use of Clicker across the district. I love that.
Yeah, it's so helpful to see when it's working. That keeps us all motivated, right? Keep trying new things. I will mention, you reminded me, Sarah, that Cricksoft, usually when they sell a district a package of licenses, they'll also publish a website that pertains to your district, and that's where we have our Bellingham launch webinar. So it's actually hosted by Cricksoft. And so from our internal AT website, I link to the Cricksoft page, because I don't really want to have to keep updating information that's already typically available when their website works. So be on the lookout for those like customized landing pages from Cricksoft. All right, well, regarding collaboration, I just wanted to include this story from an OT, which was really lovely. It was about how she saw inclusion at work when she supported her student in writing about orcas, the topic that the class had been exploring. And they were in an OT session outside of the classroom. But when he re-entered the classroom, the teacher highlighted his work and projected it for the whole class, and they read it together. And it was this lovely, it was a meaningful, an example of very meaningful participation for that student. Okay, I think we have just a few more minutes. Are there any questions that we could try and tackle? We appreciate you so much coming. I know it's really hard in these busy days. I applaud you making it to this webinar in the middle of a workday.